Let's move on to the D27, which is also known as the Bumster. The D27 reveals our strength and capacity to overcome conflict, both within and around us. The D27 is a third house Varga. The third house is an Upachaya house, a house of growth through effort. And so the third house is associated with courage, repetition, and willpower. It shows how we face struggle, whether that struggle is physical, psychological, or spiritual. In that sense, the D27 illustrates our personal battlefield, how we fight, how we endure, and how we rise when life pushes back. Mars is the Karaka of the D27. Mars governs our drive and our inner fire to overcome and succeed. And so a strong Mars points to a person who can set goals and stand their ground when tested. But Mars in the D27 is not just brute force, it's the disciplined strength that comes from years of inner training. It shows whether our inner fire is focused and purposeful, or on the other hand, whether it is scattered and self-defeating. The D27 is particularly useful for understanding how we grow through life's resistance. Right? It shows how we respond to competitive or stressful environments, in the workplace, in family life, in relationships, and even in our own minds. It shows how we handle pressure, whether we collapse, lash out, or grow stronger through the challenge. In that way, the D27 is a Varga of life improvement because it reveals the very mechanism by which strength is forged. Upachaya houses, like the third house, teach us that mastery is earned. Right? We are not born with perfect strength or perfect discipline. We gain it by doing the work again and again through trial, error, and persistence. And so the D27 offers great insights regarding this. Where do we give up too soon? Where are we reactive instead of strategic? Where do we sabotage our own power? Where there's a fight, there are enemies and obstacles, but not all enemies are external, right? Oftentimes they live inside us. Pride, fear, addiction, avoidance, to name a few. The D27 shows whether we conquer those inner enemies or whether they control us from the shadows. And so the D27 exists to teach us a vital principle, which is true strength is not domination, but self-mastery. It's not about fighting every battle, it's about knowing which battles are worth fighting and showing up to them with clarity and determination. So now let's take a closer look at this example and start with analyzing the main factors to get an overall idea of this person's ability to confront inner and outer obstacles. So Mars is the Karaka of the D27. Mars is not only the Karaka here, but also the Lagna Lord, which makes it even more important. Mars is here in the 9th house and in Sagittarius, and thrives to use its will and energy for actions that are purposeful and uplifting. However, when we look around, then we can see that Mars is under serious pressure. Right? Mars is aspected by Saturn and Rahu. And these are the big separators disrupting Mars's energy. Jupiter here is a manifester and comes to Mars's rescue, but by itself it won't be able to make up for the serious affliction caused by Saturn and Rahu. As a result, Mars's capacity to act with clarity and focus gets compromised. With Jupiter's help, the inner fire is still burning, but in a way that is flickering and unreliable. Saturn gives Mars feelings of guilt, and Rahu adds confusion. And so the person's effort can easily get discouraged. Next, we can also analyze the important third house, which is associated with effort and discipline. And here the third house is only influenced by the moon, who is waxing in this horoscope. So it is a gentle moon. But more importantly, the moon is in the 10th house. and becomes a manifester of the willpower needed to improve upon life. The third house is ruled by Saturn, who is aspected by Rahu and Mars, both together increasing frustration and lack of progress. Now luckily, Jupiter and Venus here come to help and stabilize Saturn. And so Saturn overall turns out okay. And overall, the third house is better than its worst. We can also analyze the fifth house, which is the third from the third, which is our strategic intelligence that sustains effort over time. It's aspected by the waxing moon, which helps a bit, and also here by the sun from its natural friend sign, and that adds stability. But the fifth lord, Mars, is here again afflicted by Saturn and Rahu, reinforcing the pattern of scattered will and effort. And so the person might try to act with sincerity, but they are stopped by their own doubts, and then they might run away from the problem through some type of escapism. The other important house is here third from the Karaka Mouse, which falls in Aquarius. And this one is similar here to the third cusp. Aquarius also here gets manifested once by Mercury, and it is also here without serious affliction. Right? And this shows that when the person is able to detach and think clearly, they can actually make good decisions and stick to them. But underlying, we can see that there is still the same significant struggle to overcome difficulties and make progress in life, because Aquarius is again here ruled by Saturn. And we can see here that Saturn is subjected to the same type of fundamental weakness of will in the D27. The other important house is the fifth from the Karaka Mars, which falls in Aries, which is unaspected, and it is ruled by Mars, and we have again the same type of a scenario here with this scattered will and effort. So overall, we can conclude that this person struggles to exert their will power consistently. There's an inner drive to improve life, and there might be periods where they are successful, but those will be followed by periods of inner weakness that cause repeating conflicts. So now let's see what exactly this person here is struggling with, and let's start here with Venus Dasha, which started when they were 17 years old. Venus is in Gemini, but it is conjunct the 12th house of loss. And it is heavily afflicted by Saturn, Rahu, Mars, and Ketu. Each of these planets diminishes Venus's ability to overcome problems. And of course for Venus, that primarily means love and marriage problems. In Venus Dasha, a person in general seeks, emotional connection, relationships, and marriage. But considering the amount of affliction that Venus suffers here in the D27, the person, the moment that they stepped into a relationship, it just became too complex, too draining, and too chaotic to handle. And so after a few weeks or a month, usually disillusionment set in, and they got emotionally exhausted and just couldn't continue. Venus in the 7th house in the D27 don't show how we love, but how we handle struggle within love. And Venus here also rules the 7th house and is just too afflicted to be able to face that struggle with clarity and enough inner strength. And so even though this person was excited to enter romantic relationships, it didn't take long before a pattern became clear that each relationship brought the same disappointment and an eventual conflict that just became impossible to resolve. And we can see that there's just too many inauspicious factors afflicting Venus. Venus is conjunct the 12th house of loss. It gets aspected by Ketu from the 12th house of loss. Saturn is conjunct the 12th house as the important third lord, and also the third lord from the Karaka Mars. Mars is conjunct the 6th house and also the Karaka of the D27 afflicting Venus. And then there's also Rahu here aspecting Venus from the 6th house. And so Saturn tends to bring doubt, inner blockage and delay. Rahu is going to amplify the emotional struggle and sort of also gives a distorted idea of how to actually deal with problems. And then Mars makes the person impulsive and reckless. And so it's really no wonder that this person, a few years into Venus Dasha, gave up on relationships altogether. They became convinced that none of their future relationships had any potential for long-term success. And so they retreated from this battlefield and instead started to focus on themselves. Venus simply wasn't ready and strong enough early on. It wasn't until much later, towards the end of Venus Dasha, that the person finally felt ready to open their heart again. Not with fantasy or out of some impulse, but with greater maturity and self-awareness. As with any affliction, any Varga, they're there to show us our weakness, while also offering an opportunity to turn that weakness into one of our strengths. And so this person in Venus Mars became very serious about their spiritual life. They even lived for some time in a spiritual community. And we can see this here with the 11th Lord Venus in the 12th house, which creates the environment of a spiritual community that allowed them to develop their inner strength. And this started in Venus Mars. Right? We can see here that Mars is also in Sagittarius, the sign of self-knowledge and spiritual fire. And of course Mars is here the planet of self-discipline and training.